Inside Pelican Bay SHU, how silence is enforced. There is a place in the United States prison system where silence is not just expected, it is engineered. A place where human contact is reduced to almost nothing. Where prisoners can spend years, sometimes decades, without a handshake, a conversation, or even the sound of another person's voice up close. This is not a myth. It is not speculation. It is Pelican Bay State Prison Security Housing Unit, commonly known as the SHU. Opened in 1989 in one of the most remote corners of California, Pelican Bay was designed with a specific purpose: total control. Inside its SHU, inmates are held in near total isolation for 22 to 24 hours a day. No communal meals. No shared spaces. No physical contact. And for years, many of the people placed here were not serving punishment for new crimes, but because of something far less visible: alleged gang affiliation. How that system worked. How silence became a tool of control. And why it eventually sparked one of the largest prison protests in U.S. history. Is a story built on documented facts, legal battles, and first-hand accounts. And it begins inside a concrete cell, designed to erase human interaction. Where Pelican Bay sits. Pelican Bay State Prison is located near Crescent City, California, just miles from the Oregon border. It is one of the most isolated prisons in the United States. This location was not accidental. According to California corrections officials, the remoteness was part of the design, reducing outside influence, limiting escape risk, and allowing tighter control over high-risk inmates. But within Pelican Bay, there is a facility even more restrictive than the main prison. The Security Housing Unit. Or the SHU. Unlike general population units, the SHU was built without windows facing the outside world. Instead, cells are constructed from solid concrete, with heavy steel doors and minimal openings. Inside, inmates are kept alone. For most of the day, the only human presence is indirect, voices echoing through walls, or guards speaking through metal doors. This is what researchers and legal experts refer to as long-term solitary confinement. And at Pelican Bay, it became one of the most controversial prison practices in modern American history. Designing isolation. Each SHU cell measures approximately 8 by 10 feet. Inside, there is no decoration. No color beyond gray concrete and steel. A fixed bed. A stainless steel toilet and sink. And a solid door with a narrow slot for food trays. Natural light is extremely limited. Instead, fluorescent lighting defines day and night. Inmates typically remain inside these cells for at least 22 hours a day. Exercise, when allowed, takes place alone. In small, enclosed concrete yards, sometimes described in reports as dog runs. There is no physical contact with other prisoners. Meals are passed through slots. Conversations, if they happen at all, are shouted through walls. According to multiple documented accounts, some inmates spent years in these conditions without meaningful human interaction. And for many, there was no fixed release date from the SHU. Because placement was not always based on behavior, but on classification. Why the SHU was created. To understand how the SHU came to exist, you have to go back to the 1970s and 1980s. During that period, California prisons experienced rising levels of violence. Prison gangs, including groups like the Aryan Brotherhood, Mexican Mafia, and Black Guerrilla Family, were identified by officials as major sources of organized crime within prisons. According to state reports, these groups were not just operating inside prison walls. They were directing criminal activity outside as well. Assaults, drug trafficking, and coordinated violence were often linked to gang leadership. In response, California corrections officials began developing a new approach. Isolate those considered the worst of the worst. The SHU at Pelican Bay became the centerpiece of that strategy. The goal was clear. Remove influential gang members from the general population. Cut off communication networks. And prevent organized violence before it could happen. But the method used to identify these individuals would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the system. The validation process. In Pelican Bay, inmates were often placed in the SHU through a process known as gang validation. This process did not require a new crime. Instead, prison officials used a point-based system to determine whether someone was affiliated with a gang. Evidence could include possession of certain symbols or drawings, association with validated gang members, confidential informant statements, written materials or coded messages. In many cases, inmates argued that this evidence was circumstantial, or misinterpreted. Legal filings later revealed that even artwork, books, or political writings could be used as part of validation criteria. Once validated, an inmate could be placed in the SHU indefinitely. Not for a fixed sentence, but until they were considered no longer a threat. And for years, one of the only ways out was through a process known as debriefing. The cost of silence. Silence inside the SHU was not accidental. It was the result of design, policy, and enforcement. Inmates were separated physically. Communication was limited. And social interaction was nearly eliminated. Over time, researchers and mental health experts began documenting the psychological effects of prolonged isolation. Symptoms reported in multiple studies included anxiety, depression, cognitive difficulties, heightened sensitivity to stimuli. Some inmates described losing track of time. Others reported difficulty maintaining focus or memory. These findings would later become central in legal challenges against the SHU system. But at the time Pelican Bay was operating at full capacity, the system remained in place. And for many inside, the silence continued. The only way out. For years, inmates inside Pelican Bay's SHU faced a reality that was difficult to escape. Not because of locked doors alone, but because of policy. Once validated as a gang affiliate, there were typically only a few ways out of the SHU. Serve a determinate SHU sentence, if one had been assigned. Be cleared through a rare administrative review. Or enter a process known as debriefing. For many inmates, debriefing became the primary path out of indefinite isolation. But it came with consequences that extended far beyond the prison walls. What is debriefing? Debriefing is a formal process in which an inmate provides information about gang activity. This can include identifying other members, describing organizational structures, or revealing past actions tied to prison gangs. According to official CDCR policy, the purpose of debriefing was to disrupt gang networks and reduce violence. But critics, including legal advocates and former inmates, have described the process differently. They argue that debriefing effectively required inmates to become informants. And once an inmate entered the process, there was no turning back. Statements were documented. Names were recorded. And that information could be used in future validations. In practical terms, this meant that one person's debriefing could influence the fate of many others. The risks of speaking. Inside prison systems across the United States, being labeled an informant carries serious risks. At Pelican Bay, this reality was well understood. Inmates who debriefed were often transferred out of the SHU. But they could face potential threats in other prison environments. Because of this, many prisoners refused to participate. Court testimonies and advocacy reports describe a dilemma. Remain silent, and stay in isolation indefinitely. Or speak, and face uncertain consequences. Some inmates maintained their innocence, arguing they had been wrongly validated. Others chose silence as a matter of principle. And for those individuals, the SHU could become a long-term reality. In some documented cases, inmates spent over a decade under these conditions. How silence was maintained. Silence in Pelican Bay's SHU was not just physical. It was systemic. Cells were designed to prevent communication. Movement was tightly controlled. And interactions were minimized. Even recreation time was structured to prevent contact. Inmates were escorted alone, placed in individual exercise areas, and returned without encountering others face to face. Mail was monitored. Visits were limited and conducted through glass barriers. In many cases, the only consistent human interaction came from correctional staff. And even that was brief and controlled. According to multiple reports, this level of isolation made it difficult for inmates to organize, communicate, or challenge their conditions collectively. But over time, that began to change. Signs of resistance. Despite the restrictions, inmates in Pelican Bay found ways to communicate. Messages were passed through legal mail, through coded writing, and sometimes through conversations shouted across corridors. Over time, a shared understanding began to emerge among prisoners. Their placement in the SHU was not always based on behavior, but on association. And many believed the system lacked a clear path to release. By the late 2000s, these concerns were being documented more widely. Advocacy groups began publishing reports. Attorneys filed legal challenges. And families of inmates started raising awareness. But inside the SHU itself, a more direct form of protest was being considered. The 2011 hunger strike begins. In July 2011, something unprecedented happened inside Pelican Bay's SHU. Inmates began refusing food. The protest started with a small group, but quickly spread. According to official reports and media coverage, hundreds of prisoners participated within days. Eventually, the hunger strike expanded beyond Pelican Bay, reaching thousands of inmates across California. The demands were specific and documented. They included an end to long-term solitary confinement, changes to gang validation policies, improved conditions, including access to basic necessities, and a clear path out of the SHU. This was not a spontaneous act. It was organized. And it marked one of the largest prison protests in U.S. history. Official response. California prison officials responded publicly to the hunger strike. They acknowledged the protest, but defended the SHU system as a necessary tool for maintaining safety. According to CDCR statements at the time, gang management strategies, including isolation, were critical in preventing violence within prisons. Officials also stated that inmates in the SHU had access to due process through classification reviews. However, critics argued that these reviews were often insufficient and rarely resulted in release from isolation. As the hunger strike continued, concerns grew over inmate health. Medical staff monitored participants. Negotiations were discussed. And the situation gained national attention. But for many inside the SHU, the core issue remained unchanged. A system under scrutiny. The events of 2011 brought increased scrutiny to Pelican Bay and its SHU. Legal organizations intensified their efforts. One case, in particular, would become central to the debate. Ashker vs. Brown. Filed on behalf of inmates held in long-term solitary confinement, the lawsuit challenged the constitutionality of indefinite SHU placement. The case argued that prolonged isolation violated the Eighth Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. It also raised questions about due process, and whether inmates were being held without sufficient evidence. The legal battle would take years, but it would ultimately lead to one of the most significant changes in California's prison system. The 2013 hunger strike. In 2013, the protest returned, larger than before. On July 8, inmates across California prisons began another coordinated hunger strike. This time, the scale was unprecedented. According to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, approximately 30,000 inmates participated at its peak. It extended far beyond Pelican Bay. Facilities across the state reported widespread involvement. The demands remained consistent with those outlined in 2011. An end to indefinite solitary confinement. Reform of gang validation practices. Improved living conditions. And meaningful opportunities to return to general population. The strike lasted for nearly 2 months. Medical concerns escalated as participants refused meals. Some inmates required hospitalization. The situation drew national attention and international concern. For the first time, the conditions inside Pelican Bay's SHU were being discussed on a global stage. National and international pressure. Media coverage intensified. Major news outlets began publishing detailed reports on solitary confinement in California. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, raised concerns about long-term isolation. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture had previously stated that prolonged solitary confinement, beyond 15 days, could constitute cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. While this statement was not specific to Pelican Bay alone, it added weight to the broader debate. Lawmakers also took notice. Hearings were held in California to examine prison policies. Former inmates, experts, and corrections officials provided testimony. The SHU system, once largely hidden from public view, was now under sustained scrutiny. Ashker v. Brown, the turning point. At the center of this shift was a federal lawsuit. Ashker v. Brown. Filed in 2009, the case represented inmates who had spent years, some decades, in Pelican Bay's SHU. The plaintiffs argued that indefinite solitary confinement, based largely on gang validation, violated constitutional protections. They also challenged the lack of meaningful review processes. After years of litigation, a settlement was reached in 2015. The agreement marked a major change in California's prison system. Indefinite SHU placement based solely on gang affiliation would be significantly restricted. Thousands of inmates became eligible for review. And many were transferred out of long-term solitary confinement. For the first time in decades, the system that enforced silence was being dismantled. The step-down program. Following the settlement, California introduced new policies, including the step-down program. This system was designed to transition inmates out of the SHU gradually. Instead of requiring debriefing as the primary exit path, inmates could now progress through structured phases based on behavior and compliance. The program included increased access to programs and reading materials, more opportunities for monitored interaction, regular reviews to assess progress. According to CDCR, these changes were intended to reduce reliance on long-term isolation while maintaining security. However, some advocacy groups argued that concerns still remained. They questioned whether the reforms went far enough, and whether conditions in alternative housing units still involved forms of isolation. The full impact of these changes continues to be studied. What changed? And what didn't? The Pelican Bay SHU did not disappear. But its role changed. Indefinite isolation based solely on gang validation was reduced. More inmates gained pathways out of solitary confinement. And the use of long-term isolation declined. Yet, solitary confinement itself did not end. It remains a part of the U.S. prison system, used under specific conditions. Debate continues among policymakers, researchers, and human rights organizations. Some argue it is necessary for safety. Others point to its documented psychological effects and call for further reform. What is clear is this: Pelican Bay became a symbol. A case study of how far a system can go in enforcing control. And what happens when that system is challenged. The human element. Behind every policy, every lawsuit, every statistic. There are individuals. Some were placed in the SHU due to confirmed involvement in organized prison activity. Others maintained they were wrongly classified. The full truth of every individual case is not always publicly documented. But the conditions they experienced, and the system that placed them there, are part of the historical record. Pelican Bay's SHU was designed to enforce silence. And for years, it succeeded. Until that silence was broken. Pelican Bay's SHU stands as one of the most documented examples of long-term solitary confinement in modern history. A system built for control. Maintained through isolation. And challenged through resistance, law, and public scrutiny. The story is not just about one prison. It is about how institutions balance security and human rights. And what happens when that balance is questioned. Because in the end, silence can be enforced. But it does not last forever. If you found this documentary informative, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the Inmate Diaries. Your support helps us continue bringing you real, fact-based stories from inside the world's most secure prisons. And if there's a case you want us to cover next, let us know in the comments.